Shalom from Jerusalem, and this is Powers in Play, our monthly program looking at Israel and the Middle East from another broader prism, that of global and regional powers. And this is the first program for 2025, and we will try to look at Israel's geostrategic problems, challenges, and opportunities as the year begins. And with us is a very distinguished panel. The only non-distinguished member is the moderator, Reserve Colonel Dr. Eran Lerman, formerly with the Directorate of Military Intelligence and the National Security Staff, which you were the deputy head of. Welcome.
Thank you.
Reserve Brigadier General Dr. Amnon Sofrin. How did you have the time to reach so high a rank and a PhD?
It took me some time, but I arrived in the end.
I directed it at Eran Lerman too, but hopefully the two aspirations did not conflict.
No, they don't have to.
Conversely, they help each other. So Amnon Sofrin, formerly of military intelligence and Mossad, also in senior positions. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Arad, formerly the head of the intelligence division for Mossad and the head of the National Security Staff, as well as the political advisor to a certain prime minister who is still with us. Dr. Arad, hello. Welcome. And Ambassador Dani Ayalon, also of the same political bureau of the Prime Minister's office, but also with other prime ministers who succeeded Netanyahu, Ambassador Ayalon, formerly the ambassador to Washington, and a deputy foreign minister and member of Knesset. Dani, let's start with you because we ended the introduction with you, so we have to compensate you.
No, I can understand because, Amir, I'm thinking as the non-distinguished, I'm also with you because we are surrounded by 3 PhDs. And I'm very to see that these 3 PhDs did not pursue an academic career, but rather a more, let's say...
They pursued our enemies.
But you know what Henry Kissinger said about the academy, you know, why the politics there is so strenuous, because the stakes are so low.
So let's talk about high stakes, and that is the big power competition, great power, and its effect on the Middle East and Israel. How does what the Americans claim to be their competition, mostly with China, but also with Russia, and Russia still being involved in its war with Ukraine, how is it going to impact Israel?
Well, this is a very good question because we know that for the Trump administration, China is a very high risk and a very high priority. Actually, you see his team. Some of them actually prefer, planning a strategy on China before even the Middle East. So there is a competition there between the Middle Easterners and those who are the Far Easterners. It's very... Russia, on the other hand, we have some people in the Trump administration who are fans of Russia or Russophiles. So it's very hard to determine right now where will the United States go. My feeling is that their big fish to fry, as they see it, will be China. So a lot of their resources, that means manpower, thinking, military presence, will be in the South China Sea, in the Far East. Russia, they believe, is very much weakened by its operation in Ukraine, so they're not going to do anything with Russia. They're going to let it fall by itself. And then we come to us. How will that determine their attention spent to the Middle East, especially for Iran? And here I believe that Iran, and again here, many like the Rubio, which is going to be the
Senator Marco Rubio.
Yes, and Mike Waltz, and all of their team are very hawkish on Iran. Talked many years about a credible military threat. Now, when they will be in power, they'll have to put the word in their mouth to see what they're really doing. The responsibility will be on them. I believe that from Israel's point of view, number one priority is Iran, notwithstanding what's going on in Syria and the fall of the Assad regime. And here, our main challenge will be to coordinate everything with the new administration in Washington, and understanding or thinking that I understand Trump, the art of the deal author, he will try to strike a deal with Iran. Hopefully, when he does that, he will understand that he has all the cards, so it's going to be a JCPOA, which will be longer, stronger, and added to it is the ban on ballistic missile testing and on subversion and terrorism throughout the region.
Thank you, Danny. Dr. Arad, you were with Mossad since the mid-1970s, approximately. And that means that for the next 15 years or so, the Cold War was still raging. The question is, during the Cold War, the Middle East was a secondary theater for the United States. Everything emanated from the primacy of the Cold War. From what we heard from Ambassador Ayalon, it seems as if the US government, once again, is going to set its priorities according to the primacy of the near-peer competition with China. And once again, the Middle East, which was so prominent from the early 19th on, is going to be back somewhere in the boondocks.
Well, sure, if you put things in that perspective, it is interesting to see the shifts and changes. I remember the Cold War, and at that time, we did not used to refer to Europe as, we call it the central balance, the central. Word central, it was Eurocentric. And indeed, most of the Cold War was, at least the confrontation which never erupted, was on the European theater. The Middle East then evolved in that same context, and of course it spilled over into the Middle East at a time in which essentially some of the countries of the Middle East came under the patronage of the Soviets, and we were on the American side or on that side, and things were clear. The thing that changed and indicated that maybe a change occurred towards the end of the period. The most dramatic was the revolution in Iran, which we still, clearly it was the most important event to happen, and it came as a surprise. And that has not been sufficiently studied as the most important surprise that had happened us, rather than, say, the 73 surprise that everybody celebrated. But then towards the end of the century, you had the great shift. The Cold War subsided. And of course, all eyes turned to the new rising power, which became China. And indeed, China, as it rose, it became more assertive. So to say, its aggressive tendencies evolved with their rise. And naturally, the pivot east was inevitable when it came to the United States. But then the surprising thing is that here too, the Middle East, which was not central to the thing, becomes involved. The Middle East now, from which the United States wanted to withdraw all the time because of the unpleasantness of Iraq or Afghanistan, it is still sucking in American involvement, either as an effect of what has happened by surprise in Europe, when Russia became suddenly aggressive, and you have this resurgence of the West in Europe. And at the same time, there is still China, the China factor, with China taking sides, in our case, for example, becoming an ally to some extent with Iran. And again, you have the powers being drawn to the Middle East in spite of their wishes, because of it is marginal to the global race, but the race has shifted completely. So the Middle East is there to be there, but the shift and the center of attention has shifted dramatically to the east, and I think that Danny presented it rightly.
General Sofrin, we've been talking about 3 of the 4 members of what appears to be an axis: China, Russia, and Iran. But there's a 4th one, North Korea. You had, of course, something to do with the exposure of the North Korean efforts to build a nuclear reactor in Syria, which the Israeli Air Force destroyed in 2007. You had a major role in this exposure when you headed the intelligence division of Mossad. We haven't heard a lot about North Korea in the Middle East recently. We know that the North Koreans are helping the Russians in the Ukraine. The US government revealed that it was a North Korean request to take part, perhaps to gain some combat experience, rather than a Russian request for the North Koreans to help. And Secretary of State Blinken confirmed a few days ago that 10,000 North Korean casualties have already been counted in the Ukraine over the last few months. Does that mean that North Korea is no longer interested in the Middle East, and that Israel can at least make do with one less enemy, or at least a helper for the enemies?
I wouldn't say that. North Korea is part of an axis that is based on Russia, but with Russia you have China and you have Iran, and North Korea is the 4th leg. Now, North Korea, as part of this membership, is first of all assisting right now Russia because they wanted to be involved, and they volunteered to send troops into Russia, to train them and to be able to fight in Ukraine, just like they do right now. I think that the figure that you mentioned right now about what Blinken said, that 10,000 casualties, is exaggerated. It's not that much. They sent 10,000 people there, and I don't believe that all of them are dead. Part of them, of course.
Maybe he also included mental cases, post-traumatic, because the North Koreans are very sensitive.
Sure, they are, of course. Now, the fact that they are now part of what we call very tight with Russia, and Russia is tight with Iran, that means that some knowledge can be transferred to Iran as well, and not only to Russia. And that means that the involvement in the Middle East can be larger than before, of North Korea, I mean. They assisted the Syrians before, the Bashar Assad, in power, and now they are shifting into assisting Iran as part of this membership, as part of this axis, and I believe that it's not the last war that we see in the Middle East in the involvement of North Korea.
Dr. Lerman, up to now, we have talked about powers which are all nation states. But there is one, perhaps not really a power, and not really a state, even though they aspire to. This is ISIS, the Islamic State, which reportedly is no longer having any territorial outposts, but nevertheless, they still have many thousands of detainees in Syria, which, if they manage to spring out of prison, can reconstitute a combat force. And we have heard of terror acts within the United States by Americans who pledged allegiance to ISIS. So is that a factor? For instance, in his first term, President Trump wanted to take the American presence, military presence, out of Syria, and he was persuaded, not because of ISIS, which is the reason for them being there, but in order to guard the oil fields, because oil is very important to Trump. He sees it as an asset. But could there be now a shift in American policy because of the perceived resurgence of ISIS?
That's an interesting question. By the way, we talked earlier about the axis, and I have come across a good shorthand, CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That's a much more concrete axis than the BRICS, which is more of an invention because actually India and China don't hang together, and Brazil, of course, depends where it stands and who leads it. But the CRINC is a strategic
Not to mention
challenge.
South Africa.
And South Africa was added as a...
For the S.
For the S, yes. As a symbol of something, of the South.
Yeah.
African presence.
African presence, and of course their moral standing and so on and so forth in the global South.
Even though now they have much more.
ISIS, well, of course, basically is now a social media proposition. It works through the networks. The strategy of tamkin, of creating areas of control, zones of control by ISIS, has so far not been revived since it was destroyed in northern Syria and northern Iraq. There are claims here and there. Boko Haram have pledged allegiance. The terrorists in Sinai have pledged allegiance, and they call themselves the Sinai province. But they've also been largely repressed by the Egyptians. And so I wouldn't count them as a strategic presence, quite the same level as they were, let's say, 10 years ago, at the turn of 2014 to 2015, where there is a problem, and I think it could become much more serious, is the interconnection between other jihadist elements and the government of Turkey. And the ultimate reason why people went to Trump to persuade him not to leave Syria back in his previous term of office, people like Senator Lindsey Graham and others, was not so much because of the fear of ISIS, which was largely under control by them, but because Turkish domination would have meant the destruction of an American ally. And here we are in a very paradoxical...
You mean the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, mostly Kurdish?
Which is very paradoxical, because the ideological mother organization of the YPG, the PKK, is listed by the Americans as a terrorist organization. But the daughter in Syria is an ally of the United States and have fought valiantly against ISIS in their day.
So please leave Turkey, because I saved it first for Danny Ayalon, but then I reconsidered and decided to give it to Dr. Arad.
Rightly so.
Danny should handle it.
He did already. So now it's your turn.
Well, this is what is characteristic of this very moment is the question about Turkey and its policies and in its ability to insert itself into Syria. And there, the Kurdish issue being the one that makes it being more active, but at the same time, this is an association, say, with jihadist groups, so it is a complication that we are looking at and we are baffled by and see how it will transpire. But then it is the future of Syria itself, which from Israeli points of view, but also in terms of the Middle East, what will happen with Syria and what forces will dominate. Would it be indeed those ethnic forces, that is to say Kurds as against non-Kurds, but then you have other ethnic groups? Will that be the dominant? Or will be the dominant thing the orientation of that group, say, be it under the patronage of one country or another?
But could there be a Turkish-Israeli co-dominion of Syria?
Well, you see, one of the characteristics of many of those players is that they go for very high stakes and are taking some adventurous steps. I would say that to think that it would develop into a kind of a joint arrangement in which we have an interest in a certain political configuration in Syria and others, and that will dominate the scene, I'm not aware that this is within our ability to influence to that full extent.
But there is a common denominator between the countries. Turkey took Alexandretta, Israel took the Golan Heights, and Syria, at least for the time being, had to accept it.
Well, we can play that game. It's been played in other parts in which countries were to be divided. Last to hear that was Iraq, and they were. I don't think that Lebanon is serving as a good example of partitioning political power along the lines of religious tendencies. But there are some countries that even propose to themselves to break down into tribes and to fall back on some socio or ethnic divisions, and that's Israel itself. So suggestions of these constructions, be them federated structures or all kind of things, I don't know whether they will survive, whether one could accomplish that in a stable way. In fact, the only thing that it can guarantee is shifting the friction areas from one type of friction to another. That is to say, if you'll have a breakdown, they will be fighting one another. So I don't see that's happening, and it's a big question mark. And we have to watch this with sufficient acceptance of our complete inability to foresee the actions and the performance of some of the local actors.
Ambassador Ayalon, and the accent is on ambassador because this has to do with the next question. The one regional power which we did not mention up to now is Saudi Arabia. Perhaps the two veteran ambassadors to Washington who had a lot of influence across administrations were Anatoly Dobrynin on the Soviet side and Bandar bin Sultan, the Saudi ambassador whose daughter is now the Saudi ambassadress to Washington. Now, Saudi Arabia, of course, is a financial power, a petrodollar power, but not a military one. And we have seen President Trump going to Riyadh as one of his first steps.
Dancing with the sabers. And,
Right, saber rattling
Yes.
With the Saudis. And, of course, trying to convince them to support the Abraham Accords and perhaps now normalization with Israel. Do you see Saudi Arabia, and we know that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, is not involved right now in the administration as he was earlier. Do you see Saudi Arabia playing a major role in the American policy in the Middle East?
Well, the short answer is yes, because the Saudis' interest, that means of the MBS, and of course all the princes and the kingdom, the royalty, is to preserve their power in Saudi Arabia. And this power, has been challenged by the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, even Hamas. So in that respect, and Hezbollah, of course, what they see now, I think, is an opportunity. The fiasco of MBS a few years ago when he arrested Hariri, the former prime minister of Lebanon, in the attempt actually to gain influence over Lebanon and that was after the departure of the Syrians.
But at that time, Mohammed bin Sultan arrested everyone.
That is true too, right. Well, but they were at least all of them were Saudi nationals. Hariri was
in a hotel.
He was not a Saudi national. In any case, that was a big fiasco, and since then we saw a deterioration of the influence and power of Saudi Arabia in the region, also in Yemen, when they actually, by not winning the war against the Houthis, they lost the war. And in that respect, I think they do see an opportunity, both in Lebanon, but also in Syria. And there is going to be a major competition, I think. On the one hand, the Shia Sunni. Iran has not given up Syria. But within the Sunni, there is going to be, I think, a competition between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Qatar is looking into Syria to build a pipeline for their natural gas through Syria, Turkey, to Europe, and by that actually minimizing the dependence of Europe on Russian oil and natural gas. So I think there's going to be a very major power play that could be for many, many years. And the question is whether, from Israel's point of view, whether we will see a galvanizing of a new Syria under whatever leadership, or they're breaking up. What our concern, and about Turkey, what you mentioned with Uzi, is that, yes, there is a similarity between Turkey taking Alexandretta and Israel taking the Golan Heights, but that, like there is a lot of hypocrisy, only hypocrisy, I think, in diplomacy. The Turks do not see it that way. Why? They tell us to leave the Golan Heights. We are the occupiers because we were not invited. The Turks were invited by I don't know who, but this is what they claim. And I think the major threat for Israel would be if there is a real break down in Turkey, and there will be some groups of ISIS and the like, which will be supported by Turkey and maybe Qatar, starting with new terror campaign against Israel on the Syrian Golan and our Golan.
So by invitation, you mean Hotel California style or Hotel Ankara. You get in, but you never get out.
Exactly.
Dr. Lerman, Danny mentioned two of the Persian or Arabian Gulf powers, both Saudi Arabia and Qatar. What about the other medium powers, or perhaps lesser powers of the Gulf, the UAE, Bahrain? Those two are part of the Abraham Accords, but also Oman, Kuwait. Do they have any independent role to play, or are they going to follow Saudi leadership or any other compass?
Actually, while people talk about the GCC and the Gulf states,
The Gulf Cooperation Council.
Gulf Cooperation Council,
Which also has Jordan as an affiliate.
and the Egyptians and the Jordanians have some kind of relationship with it, but at the end of the day, it is not a unified group at all. Qatar plays its own game. And has always done so, and for years it was in fact under siege and isolation and boycott by the other five. The Omanis have played their own tune and are closer to Iran in many ways, and have played the role of mediator between the United States and Iran, hosting the pre-JCPOA preparatory meetings back in 2013. The Kuwaitis live in fear of everyone for very good reasons, and in any case continue to harbor some kind of mystical attachment to Pan-Arabism and to the Palestinians whom they deported in a way that bars...
The Omanis were probably the first, at least in addition to the royal Yemenites in the 60s, the first to have a relationship with Israel in the Gulf.
We significantly contributed to their ability to defeat the communist uprising there. Moroccans also. Israel had a remarkable military relationship. But yes, a military relationship with some Arab countries already back in the 70s. The Abraham Accords are more of a coming out of the closet than a new reality. But the Omanis play their own game. The Kuwaitis don't play any game, and their profile is very low. The Bahrainis are an adjunct of Saudi Arabia, which is an encouraging thing, because the Abraham Accords, they would not have signed the Abraham Accords if they did not get the blessing of MBS, which is indicative of where his real mindset is when it comes to Israel. The Emiratis are in a different league. For various reasons, largely because of their resources, but also because of a very sophisticated policy. They play their own game. They are involved across the region, from Sudan. In Yemen, they have mounted a much more successful support of the anti-Houthi forces than the Saudis did, and they continue to do so, particularly in Taiz in the north east of Yemen. Their cooperation with Israel is very close. It's when major European, not to mention American airlines stopped flying to Israel, The Emirati lines continued to go day in, day out. It's a very symbolic but important indication of the importance they attach to the relationship. And their ability to speak to the new American administration, which is the key to everything now, and turn them in the right direction, is an important part of the story.
Now, the theme for this conversation is the challenges and opportunities presented by Israel's geostrategic situation as seen through the prism of the other powers. So let me ask all of you, starting with you, General Sofrin, the same question. If this is the situation, granted that Israel has some freedom of maneuver, but it has, of course, to take care to consider the power's position. Can Israel say no
To what?
to outside pressures if policy is being set in Jerusalem, but is then presented with outside pressures, other vectors? In the final analysis, can Israel say no?
I think this is not a coherent answer because you have various countries and various challenges, and it depends on each one. You have what you call a tailor-made policy towards this country or country A or country B. That means that in some cases you have to coordinate with Americans, especially when you speak about Iran and especially when you speak about the future of Syria and what kind of Syria do we see in the next coming years. Nobody really can predict. And I believe that this is one of the great mysteries that we have to solve and to understand really what kind of country are we facing. Is it going to be an opportunity or is it going to be a risk? I'm not sure which answer is the right one. Okay. Second is the story of Iran and what kind of pressure will American choose to apply on Iran to stop the nuclear program of Iran. It can be by operating or activating what we call military force, mutual with Israel, or it can be what we call a diplomatic and economical pressure, what elected President Trump is calling maximum pressure on Iran, to make her go back to the negotiating table and to broker a new deal, which in the end will postpone the Iranian nuclear program for several years ahead. So we have to coordinate with the Americans. We don't really have to approve with everything. Of course, we're in a stand or position to negotiate and to say what is our opinion about certain things. But definitely there's going to be a lot of influence of the American administration on any policies that Israel is going to apply.
Dr. Lamon, your view?
Well, it's not only possible, it's sometimes important for the Americans that Israel will retain its ability to say no to certain propositions. Even with our best friends, we had quarrels on issues with President Reagan, with Bush 43. Remember when he, during our operation in the West Bank,
Protective edge.
he told us, Chomat Magen, defensive shield. He told us to leave, and we basically made it clear that we would do so at our own time and by our own judgment.
So he went ahead and recognized the need for an independent Palestinian state.
So did Sharon before him. That wasn't the issue. The question is that for America, it's important to be able to tell its Arab friends, look, the Israelis are our friends and allies and clients when it comes to armaments, but they are not a dependency, and therefore you have to deal with them directly and not with us. And it's important to be able to say no. It's not always wise to say no, particularly to temperamental individuals who may react unpredictably. But the basic capacity to say no must be retained, and the Americans understand it. Note what Secretary of State Blinken recently said, that one of the reasons they did not openly quarrel with the Israeli government is that they understood that every time they do so, it drives the position of Hamas and others in the region in the wrong direction. And this will remain the case in the future.
Yes, but it takes two to have a fight. Even when the
And of course-
Biden administration did not want to have daylight between themselves and the Netanyahu government,
The Netanyahu
someone
government-
in the Netanyahu government made sure that there is
And
such an
let's
opening.
remember that at the end of the day, Washington is Pennsylvania Avenue is a two-way street, and Israel has always had the capacity to find allies when it said no on the other side of the street on Capitol.
Well, now the Republicans are controlling all three, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. But both of you, Uzi and Danny, you were at the place where national security and foreign policy interface with politics, the prime minister's office. How does it look from there? The question of can Israel say no, or should it be very, very choosy, not doing it just to show its domestic audience that it can say no, but finding very rare occasions where it pays to tell, especially the US president, who has a veto power in the Security Council, in addition to other measures. What's your impression?
Well, you know, the virtues of being able to say no have been always celebrated, sometimes under the slogan that Israel should be autarkic, that it would ultimately make its own decisions, and that it should be able to act, do on its own. But that has always been an exaggeration because it carries certain costs. If you want to act as you wish, you have to pay the consequences, and sometimes it can be counterproductive. At the same time, that ability to say no has another virtue in which you can trade with it. So you have it, but then in order to get something, you concede and adjust yourself to the desires of the other party. That we have played a number of times. So we claim to want and possibly have the ability to say no, but often we would sacrifice that. To give you just one example, throughout Israel's career, it has been a question whether Israel would want to have a defense treaty with the United States. Presumably, there were many people who said, yes, it has some advantages, but not too much because it would cripple our freedom of maneuver. But I know, and this is one at least thing I know because of the intimacy of knowing that all Israeli prime ministers, all of them in their own hearts, even if they claimed that they want to return, did want a binding Israeli-American defense.
But this would have commit Israel
Yes.
to come to the rescue of the United States
Yes.
in times of need.
Yes. And you know, the theoretical question was whether we would have sent troops to Korea during the Korean War. And my guess, we would have done so.
Well, you don't have to guess. It was a case in point. Ben-Gurion, the prime minister and minister of defense, wanted it. The majority in the cabinet did not. And the compromise was to send only a medical outfit.
Yes.
And the Americans
Which
rejected
is
it.
commemorated in the main street in Seoul.
Okay. So there you have it. Yes, if we had to do that, we would do as other allies have to do. But here, in this case, we have also to take the higher level of consideration in which, with certain countries, we have such an interest in not having a fight with them that we would be willingly accommodating them, a policy of accommodation. To give you just one example, we were discussing here the significance of the regional powers, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE possibly. But we have an interest also that we do not have a kind of Eastern Front which is at odds with us, Jordan. And certainly we do not want to drift the relationship with Egypt. We are concerned by the fact that the Egyptians are increasing their military capacities. Who are they preparing themselves for? Last thing we want is to come into loggerheads with Egypt. Therefore, we have often an interest in cultivating and accommodating their interest rather than losing and getting yet another friction and another border.
Last 25 seconds, Daniel Ayalon. Yes or no? Can Israel say no?
Yes, and sometimes politically it serves both countries. You know, for Israel, for instance, when Bibi Netanyahu says, I have to do it to his more extreme party, I have to do it because the Americans otherwise will block us.
Which is
And
the
then
expectation now with President Trump coming
Exactly.
into office
Exactly.
and being very assertive. This brings our conversation to an end, but there will be other ones in the months ahead. For the time being, thank you, all of you, Eran Lerman, Amnon Sofrin, Uzi Arad, Danny Ayalon. This has been Powers in Play from TV7 News Israel in Jerusalem. Thank you. We will be again here in our studio next month. For the time being, shalom from Jerusalem.
Jerusalem Studio, now available on Spotify.